the trigger spiral is automatic and unconscious, while the wisdom spiral is conscious, deliberate, etc. Is this a fair fight? And there's a similar question for Kathryn in terms of the asymmetry between the diagnosis of what's wrong with the world, which is what the news picks up, and then the solutions or the responses or the good news, bad news versus good news. So is this hardwired? And if so, what could be a way out of the asymmetry? I'm going to turn it over to Ricken by asking him, well, you mentioned the possibility of kind of redesigning the algorithm, so to speak. So what if the way that we engaged with the news, or the way that we engaged with campaigning, the way that we engaged with human rights activism writ large, redefine your terms of the debate? Just like you said, before there was the like button, the internet was a different space. So what would be the specific mechanisms or the ways to reinstate that world where at least the operating system and the default option was not biased towards this asymmetry or reinforce this asymmetry?
Mm-hmm. Okay, those are big questions. Mm-hmm. I guess quick answers would be, I think that's really insightful to look at the asymmetry between the trigger and wisdom spirals. I think that's true to some extent. I think there's a degree, and I think it might mirror some of what Kathryn said about it. There's a thinking fast reaction to thing, and emotional. Your amygdala fires, and your prefrontal cortex takes some time to assert itself and catch up. And so there's a thinking fast, thinking slow distinction there. Whether it's a fair fight or not, I really think there's a homeostasis to this stuff. Like there is a way in which, if you think about our personal relationships, right? If we were all trigger spiraling at each other, at our partners, or at our friends all the time, we wouldn't maintain many relationships, right? And so I do think that there's a natural balance to this stuff, and that is natural. It doesn't have to be something that a psychologist teaches us or some mindfulness seminar or anything like that. Like we kind of know when we're off, and it doesn't feel good, and we know how to find our way back. So I do think that's yes, there's a fast and slow distinction there, but I think it's not necessarily an unfair fight. But I agree that our information environments can make it a very unfair fight. You know, one of the terms that the New York Times reported that I keep going back to the Russians. I just find them interesting as a lens through which to see this. But the troll army operatives in St. Petersburg, their job was to trigger people. So when they would do a social media post and they would see someone write a triggered response, they would cry "Liberala razovala," a liberal torn apart. And that was the purpose. Go around and trigger people. And they were massively assisted by these algorithms. So I think on the information architecture front, I do think we as activists and need to, in the first instance, organize using non-mediated platforms. So email, messaging platforms like WhatsApp, kind of things where just individuals have to choose to talk to individuals are going to be less corrupted, I think, than ones where you have an algorithm operating. Secondly, I think with the Digital Standards Act and some of the legislation we've seen, they're forcing big tech to make more transparent these algorithms, what they're based on, what they do to us, and they're opening up to academics to do more research about it. And it's a horror show. Every term you apply that's emotive, like say, disgusting, outrageous, ridiculous, your virality jumps up 10%, 10%, 10%. And then if you add an in-group, out-group identifier that says X, kinds of people, then it jumps up another 30%. And so that is what we're listening to, that's our editor right now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's changeable. Like you can identify that, and you can say, no, we're going to adjust the algorithm in order to not give priority to those things. So I think transparency, study, adjustment, and a bit of a shift away from these mediated platforms is part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ricken. Kathryn?
So clearly I do think some things are hardwired. I've made that argument. I do think we can short circuit the hardwireds, but you have to work at it, right? What I wanted to add was this whole point that you just made. For example, on this survey about the Mastriano and Gilbert survey, they found people in many, many countries all think the world is getting worse, all think the world is less moral. But if you ask them about their own friendship circles, they actually think their friendship circles are an exception to that rule. Okay, so asked about the actual evidence, the real evidence they have in front of them, they think it's an exception. And then another thing, if you go to the labs, there's lots of labs doing cooperative games and competitive games. I don't know if you know, like economists run prisoner's dilemma games and ultimatum games with their students. People are getting more cooperation on average in those labs. Okay, I mean, I don't know if anyone here has ever tried to run ultimatum games with your students, but your students basically completely do the opposite of what any economist would predict in an ultimatum game. So young people just are not doing what these predictions are for the games. There are changes that are happening. You don't want to influence an ultimatum game? Is that what you're saying? I see someone shaking.
No, I said that the first games were played with economic students, different from the rest of the students, because they already assume the ideology. So they always maximize.
Completely. In other words, the only people who do the right thing on these games, according to economists, are economic students who've been brainwashed to do it right. So can I just say, so ultimate game is, if you give it $1, 100 pennies to a student, and you say, you can share this with the other person, any amount, and they can just say yes or no. But if they say no, no one gets any money, right? So the economist says they should give 1 penny, and they both say yes, okay? Well, it plays out that anything less than like 33 pennies is unacceptable to anybody. And nowadays, the games are moving to about 50. In other words, if you don't give half and half, the person on the other side is outraged and they say no. So our sense of justice among our young people is really changing. And yet our notion, we don't I think, recognize that.
Thanks, Kathryn. Question for Ivan. When distinguishing between the fear that apparently drives right and left populism, is it not important to note that one of those fears is largely grounded in reality and the other is not?
Listen, not if you basically see how people vote. This is the story. I do believe that there is a major difference not only on the relations to reality, but also on the value system between these two groups. This is not about this. But in a certain way, and this is even just to develop this, populism is not so much based on fear, it's based on anxiety. Listen, there was, fear is a disciplining sentiment. In a high, strict prisons in Russia, mature criminals are very polite people. They don't basically shout at each other because the words has consequences. You cannot simply swear because then basically you can be killed. But anxious people are very loud people because basically you fear things that you cannot identify. You fear exactly the idea that world goes in the wrong direction, something is wrong, I'm not in control. While fear is very definitive. You basically fear a concrete enemy. You can fear sickness and so on. You know exactly what you fear. And I do believe this is the interesting story why during the COVID, at least in Europe, populist parties basically lost electoral support for a while because fear replaced anxiety. People know what they were fearing. And they were very much kind of reacting to this, and they were ready to listen to the government in this and so on. So from this point of view, and when I'm trying to basically make these comparisons between what is driving, these are the two groups that are structuring modern democratic politics. If you go on the streets, at least in Europe, you're going to see these two groups. You're going to see Fridays for Future, young people, and then you're going basically to see the anti-immigration right. There is no center in on the streets. And here is an interesting story. We have been surveying recently the following way. Basically, we ask people in Europe on the basis of the 5 crises that shattered Europe in the last 15 years, climate, migration, economic crisis, COVID, Russia's war in Ukraine, which one of them at most shapes your view about the future? And by the way, it's very interesting to see the different geography and, of course, the different gender and generation perspectives. Germany is totally dominated by migration. Now, 32%. The only country in which climate was number 1 was France. For Poland and Estonia, it was the war. For United Kingdom, it was COVID. Why I'm saying all this? Because there was one major difference. There was 2 crises that directly lead you to a vote. If you really believe that the climate crisis is the most important one, with a very high probability, you're going to vote either for the Greens or any party on the left. If you believe that migration is your leading crisis, high probability that you're going to write for a far right or center right. But there is one major difference. When a right-wing party, and particularly far right, is in power, suddenly people became relaxed about migration, regardless of what is happening on the ground. Italy was the example. Suddenly, only 11% of Italians defined migration as the major crisis after Meloni came to power, and to be honest, nothing has changed in reality. The number of people coming, nothing. And we're not talking on the fact that basically Europe needs migrants more than anybody else. But nothing is, but when Greens come to power, their own voters became even more troubled about, because basically they said even when our people are in power, they cannot achieve what we expect. And I do believe from this point of view, the relations to reality makes a huge intellectual difference. But if you think in terms very much of politics, this is what is very much basically how you're shaping also your political strategies.
Thank you, Ivan. And this is where I'm thinking that the abundance of riches of this gathering, this festival of ideas, is coming back to bite us, because I would rather spend an hour here with these three great colleagues and panelists, but we have to start wrapping up. So I'm going to bring together some of the questions that have to do with the future. And actually, every one of you spoke about the future in a different way. So I'm going to start with Ivan and then move on to Ricken and to Kathryn, starting with a question for Ivan. It used to be that a key feature of political movements was a vision of the future. Now political movements lack visions of the future. The question is why, but just to extend the question to Ricken and Kathryn. So what's the place of the future, of forward-looking thinking and action in the political and scholarly frameworks that you're offering in your respective fields of practice and of research?
Yeah, listen, I do believe this is one of the most important things that happened in the 20th century. Basically, most of the books that in the mid or early 20th centuries are going to be read as the utopian books. We start to read them as dystopian. And this story is that basically having a project and the project can fail, and basically, of course, this was part of the history, made people very much kind of skeptical about any type of projects like this, because what was important for the utopian project is that you view the present from the perspective of the future. And basically, this was the two major differences at the end of the 19th century between the Marxism and Freud. Freud said that the truth about the individual is in their past. Marx said the truth about the individual is in their future. One said, tell me what you're dreaming. The other said what you're basically dreaming at night. And the other was saying what you're dreaming when you awaken. This type of a political change, in my view, is not easy simply to be repaired. You cannot delete this type of a knowledge and this type of a shock. But one of the things, and this is why one of my message was, keep in mind that over-dramatization is also part of how politics works. In Europe these days, people are going to say, when 1933 is coming, or for example, is Mr. Orban a fascist, and so on. And this can look very mobilizing. But listen, Europe today is not Europe in the 1930s, with all the problems that we're talking about. Start with the most obvious. Europe in the 1920s and 1930s was a society of ex-soldiers. On the level of relations to violence and things that we're talking about, it was a totally different society. So just taking the labels from the past in order to mobilize the future action can be counterproductive. And this is why normalizing the future, telling the people, listen, there is future, and we should do certain things speedily, but we should not go into apocalyptic mode, because apocalypse and democracy does not rhyme.
Ricken?
Yeah, I think one of the second stage of the trigger spiral, like catastrophization.
Yeah.
Imagining the worst possibilities and overestimating their probabilities of happening, I think, is one of the key things that really works in political organizing. But I think good retail politics where you're listening to voters and you're going to the median voter. You're not just going to the people who are liable to that kind of fear and anxiety on something, but it resides largely in hope. If you can tell a hopeful story about the future, if you can reassure people, if you can offer them vision and a plan and leadership and the competence to deliver it, that's what generally wins in politics. It's been an unusual period where some of the doom and gloom stuff, but I think sometimes we don't listen closely enough to the populists themselves to see how they are offering that story to people, and sometimes offering it far better than traditional Democrats are doing so. And so the lesson I take from that question is like, who is offering hope, and are we doing it better than other voices?
Thanks, Ricken. Kathryn?
Yes, so in the book that Cesar referred to, and this was sort of, a lot of us have our Trump administration books, right? But it was thinking about, we talk a lot about rights, but we don't always talk about responsibilities, right? Or we think we have rights, people have rights, and the state has responsibilities, but not that sometimes people have rights and people have responsibilities. And I took two issues where those come together. And voting was one of them. Voting was one of the things I was thinking about, and that is people think I have a right to vote, but I don't have a responsibility to vote. And I did interviews with young people at Harvard, focus groups at Harvard. Amazing how many students told me that they had a right to vote and a right not to vote, and they didn't talk about a responsibility to vote. Now that got turned around in 4 years. 70% of Harvard students voted in 2020. So it shows you radical change can happen. And 70%, that's as high as Minnesota and Colorado in terms of voting levels. But I was really shocked by this notion that we have rights, we don't have responsibilities, and it's particularly important for climate change. For people to think, and Cesar does terrific work on rights-based climate litigation, and rights are key to that litigation. I think we also know that organizing on climate involves talking about rights and responsibilities, and I was very inspired by Iris Marion Young, who's a political theorist who wrote a beautiful book called Responsibility for Justice. And she said, you need to have a social connection model. Everybody socially connected to a social injustice and able to act must act, right? And so I do think that we need to have forward-looking, she called it forward-looking responsibility. And I'm so glad this conference is taking it up.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, Ricken, and Ivan, for a fantastic panel. I'm sure that folks here will want to approach you with their own questions. I have literally like 10 more. So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking the panel for this fantastic session.